Thanks, Larry, and I'd like to second Martin's vote of thanks to Larry and the BCTF for organising this event, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be part of the conversation here with you today. I think my brief for today is to do a sort of OECD 101. So my area of research is sociology of education and education policy studies, and for the better part of the last decade, I've been looking at the education work of the OECD, and particularly its Pisa program. So I want to give a sort of an introduction to that work today and tell a bit of a narrative, I suppose, about how we've got to the conference that's going to occur in the next 2 days, to try and help you just to think through a little more what the OECD does in education, why they've come here to launch the next phase of their Education 2030 project, and how you might engage with that work in a strategic way. And I think that's going to be something that will be taken up in more detail this afternoon. So I offer a kind of outsider's perspective on this work. I haven't been involved with it in the way that Martin has, so it'll be a slightly different point of view. And obviously I'm also an outsider to the BC context as well, so you'll know much more about the kind of impact that this work has had here. It would be useful to me if you could just raise your hand if you're going to be at the event in the next 2 days, just so I have a sense of who in the room, okay, great, is going to be there. Also, I'm assuming that everyone has a mobile device ready to hand with access to the Wi-Fi here. I'm going to ask you to use that in a moment, so I just thought I'd give you a brief warning to get that ready if you have one that you can use. Okay, so I thought what I'd do is start with this document here, which is the position paper for the Education 2030 initiative. It might be out of date in the next few days. I don't know, Martin, whether there's going to be a new document released to accompany the new diagram, but this is a relatively short paper that provides a good background to the work that's going to be discussed. If you haven't seen it already, it's a short read. I think it's about 9 pages, even though the document's 23 pages, because there's 14 pages of appendices that list all of the people around the world that have been involved in this work. And I think that illustrates Martin's point about the growth of this program and the buy-in from countries and various experts, policymakers, and other organisations. Now we're going to have a bit of a problem because my PowerPoint is being chopped off at the edge here. I'm not sure if we can fix that, but it's going to be difficult if it's not. Let's just go back and we'll see how we go. So the very first few sentences of this position paper explain that the Learning Framework 2030 offers a vision and some underpinning principles for the future of education. Then the second sentence of the document says, it is about orientation, not prescription. And I think that's a very interesting clue to how the OECD is thinking about this work. The psychoanalyst Adam Phillips has suggested that psychoanalysis attends to what falls out of the patient's pockets when he starts speaking. And I think this second line of the document, things are already starting to fall out of the pockets. There's clearly some sensitivity here to the view that the OECD is getting into the game of prescribing curriculum rather than just giving some high-level guidance about design principles for curriculum. Now, I think this is an open question. I'm not suggesting necessarily that they are going to be working in this prescriptive way, but I think what we can tell, oh thanks, that's fantastic, is that there's a sensitivity to the view of that work that they're already pushing back against in this document. Now, 10 years ago, in an introduction to a special issue on globalisation, knowledge and the curriculum, 2 influential curriculum theorists, Lynn Yates and Michael Young, wrote approvingly about one of the papers in the issue that argued that organisations like the OECD advocate a new political technology where formalised curriculum making is ignored. They're not in the game of focusing on curriculum. It's ignored or even contested in favour of assessment and accountability systems. And obviously, the most influential example of their work is Pisa as both an assessment and an accountability mechanism. So what I want to ask today is, are things starting to change? Is the OECD moving more strongly into the space of curriculum making than it has been previously? And so in order to answer that question, or at least to open it up a little further, I want to just offer a discussion, I suppose, of the rise, expansion and impact of the OECD's education work, with a specific focus on curriculum reform. And I'm going to talk through the structure and function of the OECD quite briefly. Then I'm going to talk about how education's become such an important part of its work. I'm going to say a few things about Pisa, and then how the OECD influences the thinking of policymakers within nations and has an impact on policy reform within nations. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. The example of Alberta, I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan, and then the OECD's Education 2030 initiative itself. Now, I want to begin with a couple of caveats, and perhaps this is where things start to fall out of my pockets as well. This is not super interesting stuff. There's a pretty small niche group of people that find this kind of discussion about the organisation and function of international organisations like the OECD particularly interesting. I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to try and tell it in a kind of narrative form, I suppose. But I do hope it will be useful, particularly to those of you who are going to be at the event in the next 2 days, just to have a sense of what the OECD does, why they're here, and what this is all about. So I'll just begin with that caveat, I suppose, and that recognition. So I think it's always useful to do a little kind of prior knowledge exercise if we want to be constructivist about these sorts of things. So I'd like you, if you've got access to a digital device, to help out with completing this sentence. So I'm using Mentimeter. If you go to the web address at the top, www.menti.com, and enter the code 221038, you should be able to respond to this prompt. And what I would like you to do, just to get a sense of people's understanding of what the OECD is, I'd like you to complete this sentence. The OECD is, and then you can finish that sentence off. You could be descriptive, you could talk about what they are, you could be evaluative, you could talk about what you think they do or shouldn't do. There is a profanity filter on this, but otherwise, it's up to you how you choose to complete that sentence, and we'll start to see those appear on the screen and get a sense of what the views in the room are. A tool of global capitalism. Reinforcing current inequitable economic order, primarily concerned with the economic growth of member nations. A neoliberal body focused on the unsupportable view of continuous economic expansion to raise public welfare. Complex and apparently driven by a neoliberal agenda. Supportive of moving forward the capitalist agenda. A mix of social and economic perspectives. Invasion, I'm not sure what the first part to that one is, but it's been cut off there. An international education policy analysis organisation, not sure what it does, hopefully I can help with that. Is there a way for a classroom teacher to understand it? And I think we might be able to just scroll down. Few more answers there. Okay, that's really helpful to me. So we have a mix of people who have some sense of what kind of organisation it is, some people that are less aware of what it does, a recognition that it's pretty complex and not always accessible to people. Lots of focus on capitalism, economic growth, forwarding a neoliberal agenda, issues of economic inequity and so forth. Okay. I think all of those are probably right in different respects. Okay, I'm going to jump back. And we'll take a little bit of a look at the structure and function of the OECD. So, as Martin mentioned, it was established in 1961, but it had a longer history as the OEEC, which was the organisation set up to administer Marshall Plan funding. And one of the core functions of the OEEC was to stop other countries making ambit claims on that function. So each country could argue for funding it needed and could argue against other countries receiving more funding than they thought they needed. So there was a horizontality there and a kind of peer review function that has stayed with the OECD throughout its history. It aims to promote, as many people just highlighted, economic growth, economic expansion, and world trade. It also has a focus on social well-being, and I think in earlier points in time, that was seen as something that was achieved through economic growth. I think there's been a shift post-2008 towards saying that the aim is social well-being and economic growth is the way to get there, but we were perhaps a bit too focused on the proxy of the economic growth and not the well-being. And there's been a bit of a rebalancing, but to what extent that's actually shifted the nature of their work is debatable. For the first part of its history, the OECD was a kind of liberal economic bulwark against communism. Up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the OECD was like a kind of economic NATO. When that occurred, though, at the beginning of the 1990s, it had to really rethink its function. What was it about now that we had a kind of global capitalist order rather than a divide between capital and communism? And it was in that context that it really started to focus on the work that it does today, generating indicators, data, numbers as a kind of global centre of calculation that could give advice to policymakers around the world. So it's become a kind of clearinghouse now of various kinds of data. It's always been ahead of the curve in terms of new technologies. This is an image down here, it's hard to make out, but it's Andreas Schleicher talking a couple of days ago at the OECD conference about AI and ethics. They're very well attuned to the next big thing and what's coming down the line and offering policy advice that can help to prepare people for those new developments. And I think that's very evident in the Education 2030 work as well. So this is how the structure works, and I think this is particularly important. So there's an OECD council that oversees all of their work, and that has representatives from all of the member countries, delegations to the OECD, ambassadors that represent the interests of countries. It has a secretariat of permanent staff that do the work, the day-to-day work, they do the analysis, they make proposals and so forth. And those two groups meet within the committee structure. Now, if you talk to the representatives from countries, they'll say that the Secretariat plays too strong a hand in deciding what happens, that they get led around by the nose by the Secretariat. If you talk to the Secretariat, they'll say, we only do what the countries ask us to do, we just do what we're told. And I think there's this kind of tension all through their work between who's setting the agenda. Is it the countries that are members of the OECD, or is it the OECD pushing things back onto countries? And that's particularly important because it has an intergovernmental structure. So it's horizontal, as I said before. It brings together all of the member countries to get some work done. It's not a supranational organisation like the EU, for example. So countries don't give power to the OECD to tell them what to do. It just brings them together to talk about what ought to be done. When it was first established, Britain wanted that approach, but France and the US wanted it to be a supranational organisation, to have more power in relation to the members. And I think there's been this tension throughout its work Sometimes it errs towards the supranational, it gets too prescriptive, and when that happens, the members get upset. Okay. So when it was first set up, there was no official place for education in the OECD's work. It just had an inferred role. It was something that was dealt with incidentally. It wasn't a focus within the organisation itself. In 1975, it did gain an official place in one of the directorates, the Directorate for Social Affairs, Manpower and Education. It then became part of another directorate in the early 1990s where it was the main focus of that work. Now this is just in that moment where the OECD is shifting what it's doing and focusing on indicators and generating data. And then throughout the 1990s, it became increasingly central to the work of the OECD. In 1997, work on Pisa began, and then from 2000, we've had Pisa conducted every 3 years. In 2002, education became its own directorate, and it was rebadged in 2012 as the Directorate for Education and Skills. So what has happened over this time is that it's gone from being marginal to arguably one of the most central areas of the organisation's work, and that's happened in the context of the datification of education. It was rebranded in the context of an organisation-wide skills strategy, so all directorates had to focus on skills, and as a result that gave education some more standing. And that comes from the human capital framing of education, the notion that education gives people skills which are a kind of global currency. Now, the Directorate for Education and Skills does two things. It measures and compares educational outcomes. And arguably, that's the most visible aspect of its work, its measurement work, particularly through Pisa. But it also supports policy development in member nations through thematic reviews. It's done a number of reviews of early childhood systems, assessment systems, higher education, and they operate in a different way. The country being reviewed submits some information about those systems. There's a series of conversations between the OECD and country representatives. It's passed back and forward, and eventually they reach a point where people are happy with the report. It's much more horizontal. The measurement work, the OECD sort of sits outside of nations, and while it's much more complex than this, it ultimately generates a league table of performance that captures the media attention when Pisa is released every 3 years. There are tensions within the organisation between these two functions. There are people within education that think the measurement has become far too strong in what they do, and that we need more of the kind of sociologically informed, qualitative, thematic review work. And I just think that's important to understand, that there's not even consensus on the inside about exactly what they should be doing or the benefits or negative impacts of some of this work. Now, education, the OECD has two parts to its budget. It has a Part 1 budget, and different parts of the organisation get a recurring amount of funding from that, and it has a Part 2 budget that gives funding for specific projects. Education doesn't get much of the first pie, it gets most of its money from the Part 2 budget. So it has to keep coming up with new programs and proving that they work well in order to keep getting that funding. One of the ambassadors to the OECD explained it to me as they have to catch and kill every meal to kind of keep themselves in the game. What that means is they've had to be very innovative and very responsive to demonstrate their value, and they've become very good at tapping into what governments are thinking about, both in OECD countries and also in non-OECD countries. They've been very successful in kind of gaining the ear of the BRIC nations, for example, and China, kind of bringing them into the conversation through their education work in ways that other directorates haven't been. So I guess the point that I really want to make here is just that education is very keen to keep developing new things and keep bringing new people in, because it has to do that to survive. Okay, let's come to Pisa. So Pisa can be sort of situated, I suppose, in a much longer history of international large-scale assessments. This phenomenon of conducting international large-scale assessments emerged in the 1950s when conversations were had at UNESCO about setting up an assessment of this kind. The IEA helped with that and did a 12-country pilot study in the 1960s. These predated national assessments. So the NAEP in the US came after some of this early work on international assessments. And it was probably when the US performed quite badly in one of the IEA studies, and it led to a Nation at Risk report, that the possible impact of this work was first seen, the kind of impact that it could have on national debate about education and education policy. We've also seen some other similar sorts of studies emerge in the Global South. Pisa has come relatively late in this history, but following on the heels of Pisa, we've seen the Pan-Canadian assessment program set up here and other national assessments like NAPLAN in Australia. Pisa has expanded massively over the time of its existence. So when it was first conducted in 2000, it had 32 participating systems. That was basically the OECD countries and 4 others. It now has 79 participating systems, so it's more than doubled in the last 18 years. It's actually the OECD's biggest media event, or at least it was a few years ago when we spoke to one of their media people. And it's one of their most successful products. And so what that has done is directed attention within the organisation onto education and set them up as a bit of a model for how you actually go about having an impact on policy. And that's given them significant sort of influence and power in return. Pisa has become a prototype for other programs. We've sort of seen a proliferation of the Pisa brand. There's PIAC, which is Pisa for adults, Pisa for development, which is Pisa for countries in the Global South or developing countries. We've seen Pisa tests for schools being developed, which allows individual schools to actually buy in Pisa tests and benchmark their kids against students in Beijing or Mexico or the US. We have an international early learning survey now, which is like Pisa for 5-year-olds. The success of Pisa has led to them just, trying to repeat that time and again and extending it out to more and more groups. Pisa it focuses on reading, mathematics, and science. They're the 3 main skills that it measures, or literacy in those areas, and it focuses on a different one of those in each assessment round, so it gives emphasis to what they call a major domain. So these are the skills that they're measuring. Martin made mention of DESECO, which is an attempt to talk about what's not being measured by Pisa, or at least by the main part of the Pisa program. So DESECO was a project to define and select a range of competencies that were seen to be important that go beyond reading, maths, and science. So it was also set up in 1997, around the same time as Pisa, and in the first instance, they focused on 3 kind of major competencies. I think there were 9 underneath, but 3 main areas, which were interacting in socially heterogeneous groups, acting autonomously, and using tools interactively. Now, those competencies have given rise to areas that have been assessed in Pisa since. So one year they focused on collaborative problem solving, and you could see how that came out of interacting in socially heterogeneous groups, for example, or using tools interactively. So this has established some competencies that they've tried to measure alongside Pisa in the various implementations. Education 2030, at least from my perspective, is effectively DESECO 2.0. There's 3 major competencies that they want to talk about now. It's being framed in the same way. The world's changing. We need to get ahead of the curve. We need to set up our young people with the new kinds of competencies that they're going to need for the world of work and for society today. And as Martin indicated, there's now a set of 3 new competencies that they want to talk about. So it's an updating of the DESECO work. And I think as a result, DESECO provides us with a useful sort of model to look at, because this sort of work's happened previously, it's happening again. We can have a look at how DESECO worked, and that will tell us something about Education 2030. So it followed a similar sort of approach where they've conducted a series of reviews, brought in experts and stakeholders to get their opinions, and held a number of international symposia to try and build consensus around that work. And the next couple of days are going to be an international symposia of that kind. Now, as I said, Pisa has expanded dramatically since they first set it up. They've changed the scale to bring in more participants. They've tried to get more out of it to make it more useful for or have a greater impact on policymakers. And they've widened the scope to try and measure not only more skills, but a broader set of competencies or capacities. So I'll just say a little bit about the scale. This is, ever since PISA was established, the OECD has been talking about human capital, obviously. PISA is a measure of human capital flows at the end of compulsory schooling within nations. That's primarily what it is. It's an economic instrument, a measure of human capital. But over the past couple of decades, the OECD has been talking about widening human capital. So they've made the argument that people need the sorts of skills that you gain through education or on-the-job training. They also bring certain kinds of genetically inherited qualities and qualities that are cultivated by the family, society, their environment, and so forth. So people have a certain kind of human capital. But the OECD has also been talking about wider human capital, which they define as the characteristics that allow a person to build, manage, and deploy their basic human capital. And these are things like grit, for example, or growth mindset. And we'll talk about a bit more about these sorts of capacities in a moment. So there's been a lot of interest in how you develop and how you measure these less explicit skills that are more tacit, kind of personal traits. Now, one reason for the interest in this is because IQ only explains why some people earn more than others up to around kind of 50%. It gives us 50% of the explanation for why someone might get a higher paying job than someone else. Economists have been puzzling over how do we explain the other part of it, and they've turned to non-cognitive skills to explain that, things like persistence and drive, which are often really just another way of talking about delaying gratification, working harder and longer in order to get what's promised. And so this is being incorporated into what PISA measures and what the OECD is telling nations that they need to be developing as an important outcome of schooling. As I said, the scale has also increased dramatically over the past 18 years with the introduction of a number of new programs, and I've been through each of those. And they've been trying to improve the explanatory power of PISA, generating more data, experimenting with different kinds of analyses. PISA's now moved into an online computer-based environment, and they're collecting all of the information about how long it takes students to answer questions, what keys they click on when they do that, and they're doing new kinds of analyses about response time and what that might tell us about the validity of the test and things that aren't just picked up by the items themselves. They've also been trying to expand and link PISA with other data sets, such as TALIS, for example. And they've developed a range of tools for making that data more available to people. They set up something they called Education GPS, which was a data visualization tool that allowed you to go on and play with the PISA data sets. So they've tried to increase the visibility and accessibility of the data as well. Okay, so let's just come back to these constructs. So in the position paper, for Education 2030, it mentions that there's currently 36 constructs that they're interested in. Now, these may not all remain in the final report on this work, but there's a whole range of different things that are being discussed as competencies that we want young people to develop today. I couldn't even fit them all on here. I'm just going to pick out a few of them because the text is so small. But they include a range of different things that I think reflects the different people that have been involved in the work so far and the kinds of things that they think are important for young people to have. So let's just talk through a couple of them. Adaptability, compassion, conflict resolution, critical thinking, curiosity, empathy, global mindset, gratitude, hope, human dignity, integrity, mindfulness, perspective taking and cognitive flexibility, proactiveness. This is just a sample, but as you can see, a sort of an odd mix in many ways of quite different types of things. Some are more simple, some are more complex, almost like compound type constructs. And what they suggest is that as they talk through these, they'll do so keeping in mind whether or not the construct can have a commonly used and understood definition. Can we define these things clearly? And is it measurable? Can the construct be given a comparative numerical value on a scale or a non-numerical account? Now, when I see something like gratitude, I think about giving that a numerical value and just immediately I think this is going to be tough. I'd like you just to take a moment to discuss that with the people on your table. So I've got two questions that I want you to ask. Should we ask our schools, and this is an important point, should we ask our schools to develop wider sets of skills and competencies in our students? And should we measure these wider outcomes of schooling? Why or why not? And I'll put the list back up just for reference, but I'd like you just to take a few minutes. I'll leave the questions for a moment, then I'll flick back to the list of competencies as well. Should we be developing them and should we be measuring them? Okay. I was going to ask people to feed back to the whole group, but I'm conscious of time and that we might open up some things here that will take us off course. So I just wanted to start that conversation at least, and if we have some time at the end for discussion and questions, we could pick up on some of the things that emerged from those conversations. I guess I would just say that I sort of participated in, or overheard what was being discussed at the front here, and there was some discussion about kind of responsibilising students, perhaps asking schools to compensate for a broader set of attributes that people develop through, just living a life in society. Is it schools' job to be developing all of those different things? Is that something that schools can even do? We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so I want to talk now about how the OECD has an impact on what happens in nations, because a lot of this seems very distant from national concerns, extremely distant from local concerns and what goes on in schools and in classrooms, very abstract, very disconnected. How does it actually shape what's happening at that level, even if we're not aware of it? And I would argue that it often does. This is the league table from the first round of Pisa. The results, it was conducted in 2000, the results were released in 2001. And you can see circled at the bottom here, Germany. Germany didn't do so well in the first round of Pisa. Well, at least they didn't do as well as they'd hoped that they would. They assumed that they were a leading industrialised European nation with a very strong Bildung pedagogical tradition. They were going to perform well in an assessment of this kind. And when they placed 20th or 21st, 22nd in the different areas, there was a lot of soul searching in Germany about why this was the case. And it's been ongoing. It's led to all kinds of education reforms in Germany in an attempt to redress that situation. I would argue that this is often called a Pisa shock. I would argue that it's that Pisa Shock, the first one in Germany, that really set the precedent for how influential Pisa could be. If the OECD could use a comparative assessment like this to create this sense of crisis, then that opens up a window for policy reform. It can be used by governments to push through new policies. This is exactly what the OECD says it's doing. So this is a quote from one of their reports, Making Reform Happen, and they suggest that the release of a highly publicised report on disappointing education outcomes or performance may engender a sense of crisis. Not because educational outcomes have suddenly changed, nothing different. There was nothing different in Germany in November as compared to December 2001. Not because outcomes have suddenly changed, but because assessments of those outcomes have. So what the OECD does is generate data that forces people to look at educational performance differently. It's what we might call catalyst data. This is a quote from a senior bureaucrat in Australia, in an education department in Australia, who also generates similar kind of data sets. And she said to us that they put out what they call catalyst data. They show what's happening in terms of the data, and it's a catalyst for governments, the media, the community, academics, to ask why. Why is this so? What happened? And what might we do about it? It doesn't tell you what to do, but it does tell you, or potentially can lead you to believe, that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I would argue that the OECD has been seeking to fill the gap in terms of what to do about that by offering more kinds of advice, more kinds of training to try and not only open up this perspective that there's a problem, but to help people think about potential solutions. And so the OECD doesn't tell countries what to do. They don't have any legal power really in that sense. What they do is they shape the way people think about education by generating new kinds of information. They create consensus about the kinds of values that we hold in relation to education, which is why they bring people together in events to try and build this kind of consensus. And that's a kind of epistemological governance. They just subtly shape what we think is true and what we believe. They also enact a kind of infrastructural governance. So they create the information infrastructure that collects all of this data and makes it available to us. And they support the function of other organisations, international organisations as well. So by providing that infrastructure, they also get to shape the way that we think about these kinds of policy problems. So this is a kind of soft power. They quietly work with ministers to tell them that you've got a problem and this is what needs to be done about it, or what you're doing here in BC is fantastic. Let the rest of the world come and have a look at what you're doing. This kind of subtle approach to shaping the debate. They're not a supranational organisation that can tell people what to do. They shift the debate globally. Now, what's happened with Pisa, and Finland is a kind of primary example of this, is it's given rise to a whole new wave of kind of policy borrowing in education. Finland did much better than Germany originally, and it led to a kind of whole phenomenon of edu-tourism. Policymakers, teachers, students from all over the world visited Finland to see what they were doing well in order to bring back something that they could do in their context to improve education. So Finland became what we might call a reference society. It became a place that people looked to for ideas about how to improve education. Now, the strong performance of other countries can be used to argue that something needs to change within your particular country, and it can also be used to argue that nothing needs to change. So people sometimes look to positive examples, and sometimes they look to negative ones, and I'd say South Korea has been a negative one in many cases. People talk about cram school, high pressure on students. They might do well in Pisa, but at what cost? We don't want to make those kinds of changes in order to achieve that improvement in our scores. Now, a good colleague of mine, Florian Waldo, has talked about this as policy projection, using the metaphor of the projector and the screen. And he says the way that we talk about the performance of other countries often tells us more about the projector than the screen. He uses an example of Germany talking about Finland having all-day schooling and the need in Germany at that time to shift and have longer hours of schooling for students. But it wasn't even the case. It wasn't true. They weren't talking about the screen, they were just talking about what they wanted to do in Germany and using Finland to justify that particular reform. So I'd just like you to take another couple of minutes to think about your particular contexts, and you can interpret that however you like. That could be BC, that could be Canada, that could be your school or your classroom, and think about what impact, if any, the OECD's education work has had in your context. What's changed at the level of practice, at the level of thinking, as a result of some of the OECD's education work? And just share those thoughts with the people around you, and maybe try and think about how that impact was achieved. I'll just give you 3 minutes for that. In the interest of time, we won't feed back again, but again, I hope there's time to continue the conversations later on. I think I need to draw things to a close, really. So I just want to say a few brief things about the impacts on curriculum. And I want to use the example of Alberta because it's one that I know quite well. So in 2012, provinces across Canada, as you're probably aware, didn't do so well in mathematics, which was the major focus of Pisa in that round. And it created national headlines, and the decline in performance was attributed to a failure of discovery mathematics, often. Now, it wasn't really picked up in Alberta when the results were released, but about a week later, Dr. Tran Davies, a parent, started a petition protesting the Discovery Maths curriculum in Alberta, and it gained attention and eventually led to a piece in the Edmonton Journal, authored by David Staples in late January the following year. And it was the first article in a 44-part series titled The Great Canadian Math Debate. And there was ongoing debate about the maths curriculum as a result of this, spurred by PISA results, but then mediated through parent lobbying and kind of media coverage. Now, I could say a lot about that, but I think what's particularly interesting is when the results of the next PISA were released in 2016, the focus that time was science, and all of the talk was about science. But on the day of the release, the Albertan government announced reforms to improve math. So this was still kind of haunting their consciousness 3 years later, or 4 years later. And I think it demonstrates how, in this case, PISA did have an impact on curriculum debate, not by pushing things down through government, but through its mediatisation, lobbying, filtering back up and starting to affect government agendas. I was going to say something about Japan, but I think I'll just leave that to one side for the moment, because I just want to say a few things about Education 2030 to finish up. So as I said, it is a kind of rebooted DSECO in response to new kinds of global challenges, and I think there'll be a lot of talk about AI and automation and the risk to jobs that that's creating, the need for new kinds of skills that are complementary to technologies that are going to be implemented in workplaces and so forth over the next couple of days. As Martin mentioned, the focus now has shifted to creating new value, reconciling tensions and dilemmas, and taking responsibility, which I think is a particularly interesting one. What is different this time? If it's a reboot of DSECO, I think there's something importantly different, and it's that there's a stronger emphasis on examples from nations, which is why people are coming to BC to talk about the curriculum here, and the operationalisation of competencies. So with DSECO, they outlined a set of competencies and sort of finished there. There's a stronger focus now, at least from my perspective, Martin might disagree, but on actually looking at what nations are doing and mapping that and offering examples of good curricular practice. They've suggested that students, teachers, school leaders and parents should share practices and experiences as concrete examples of using the OECD's Learning Compass. And so I think this raises two kind of major concerns, and I'm drawing on the work of a colleague, Keita Takayama here. The first is that I think we can look at all of the work that's been done on invisible pedagogies and hidden curriculum and think about how these kinds of competencies are things that some students are going to bring to school and others aren't. And if we valorise these, then we're going to valorise the kinds of cultural capital that some students have, and also make schools responsible for giving that to students that don't bring it, asking schools to compensate for society, in Basil Bernstein's words. There's also been a decoupling of this competency work from the original argument about lifelong learning. These competencies were things that were supposed to be learnt across the life course, but as they get attached to programs like PISA, it focuses on whether or not school systems are developing these competencies. And I think, again, that leads to pressures on schools to compensate for society. I think it's important to ask whether examples of best practice in curriculum might create new reference societies for curriculum policy in the way that Finland's performance created a reference society through PISA. And I think there's a particularly large global network of people involved who are subject to the kind of soft power influence of the OECD through their connection to this work. Policymakers, academics, schools, teachers, and so on. So many of the things that I've talked about, I think, apply to this work and how it will be developed and the kind of impact that it will have. So just to conclude then, I think PISA was set up to measure what students could do. It was never set up to measure curriculum. The IEA's studies, TIMSS and PEARLS, do that. PISA was supposed to just measure what students could do. If we see countries changing their curriculum to align with what PISA measures, in some ways it undermines the very rationale for having PISA in the first place, because it wasn't supposed to measure how well the curriculum was being implemented. There's been some interesting discontent on the governing board of PISA in recent times. As we've had more and more people come into the work, they haven't had as much say over how it is developing than member countries. There's a kind of taxation without representation. You have to pay to be involved, but only some people get to decide what it looks like. And I think this is a tension that harks back to the OECD's structure. Is it actually representing the work of the people, the governments that it purportedly serves? There's been an argument made recently by Mark Schneider in the US that with all of these new competencies being developed and efforts to measure them every 3 years, there's been a reduction in the rigour of PISA. The measurement of maths, reading and science is very well established, but when we add in these new kinds of constructs, there's not as much R&D that has been done, and it actually compromises the rigour of the assessment itself. And you can see that issue looming with the large number of constructs we looked at previously. So just to finish then, I think there's probably a few questions that could be asked over the next few days. To what extent is Education 2030 emerging from country concerns? And Martin suggested that there was strong interest from countries, so that could be the case. Or is it being pushed by the OECD as something good that countries should be paying attention to? Can the 36 constructs being reviewed be clearly defined and measured? What will be the implications for assessment and for accountability? And can the distinction between orientation and prescription be sustained? And I'll just leave it there.